Okay, good morning. So we have a small group today. That's okay. This is a scary topic. It's actually one that I've been knowing and wanting for us to talk about, but honestly kept putting off and pushing back because it is an uncomfortable topic. Um, Yvonne and I, when we talk about this, we'll, get to that, but definitely in doing some research and reading about this topic, I've just realized how uncomfortable it makes me personally to talk about sex and consent, and that I really have not done a great job talking about this with my kids. My daughter, who just turned 18, you know, we've talked about sex. We haven't really, I thought I had talked to her about consent, but then, she's told me about some things that have happened to her that are really kind of like blurry lines of consent, with, situations that she's had. And, just her not knowing what to do in those situations and really just made me feel like, oh gosh, I wish I had done a better job talking about this. And then with my son, who just turned 12, I haven't talked about these topics at all with him. And doing my reading yesterday, and he's in middle school, and like this is the prime age that I really need to start talking to us. And I don't know about you, Yvonne, like I think especially since my son, I've always in my mind relied on my husband to like, oh, that should be his job. But you know what? My husband's not great about talking about these topics with me. And so I don't know how he's going to do in his comfort level. So I might just have to get over myself and, talk about this. And thank you to the parents that I have no idea how to talk to my son either. It's really, really uncomfortable. And so that's where we're hoping to get some ideas and share some stories and support each other with having these really, really important conversations with our kids. So Yvonne, what do you have to teach us? Because
Yeah.
you're the expert, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. My kids know everything. No, I'm not. And the more I research, the more I realized where I need improvement. And I have an 18-year-old who's going to college next year. And a poor guy, we have a lot of talking to do this weekend. I'll just say that because I worry about him from the safety standpoint of like, he could really get himself into trouble unknowingly. And it's my job to make sure that he knows, about consent and things about sex and things I haven't wanted to talk about. And, for me, I grew up in a very small private school. My parents were heavily religious, and the conversation was, you don't have sex until you get married. There was no other option. We didn't talk about it. It was very shameful. There was a lot of guilt associated. In fact, I have a very specific memory of one of the pastors in my church basically told me, I think you're having a lot of anxiety in your life because you're having premarital sex, which I wasn't at the time. And so it was very like, oh my gosh, like it was just like, you know, scary, like, oh my gosh, I have to do this right. And so we never had that dialogue. I never talked to my parents at all. My mom found out I was having sex when I was like 20 years old because she went to put money in my purse and found condoms. Like that was the first conversation we ever had. And I'm still horrified to think about it. So I know that, for my kids, my youngest one, we try to talk about even just dating, and he just literally gets up from the table and leaves. And so my challenge is going to be, I have to be comfortable with it myself. And I'll be honest with you guys, like I was so glad only two parents showed up because I was like nervous to talk about it. So I guess I feel more comfortable with the video being played later. But I swore as a parent that I would do a better job than my parents did. And to be honest, I haven't. I had this awkward story. My son and I, he must have been about 15, 14 maybe. And we go to Kaiser, and there's a little pamphlet, and it's like From Boy to Man was the title of it. So I think I'm, the social worker, I could talk about everything. And I start reading it out loud, and I get to some certain points, and I literally just shut the book and put it back and was like, you need to talk to your dad. Like that was the extent of our conversation that day. And I can't even bring myself to talk about what page it was, but that's really been our sex talk. And it really, I just got to like, when you're 9 years old, like I couldn't even go beyond that. And so I think it's really important that we start to feel, I don't know if we'll ever feel comfortable, but if we do it despite the discomfort to protect our kiddos, um, it, yeah, it's not fun. And so I wanted to share some instances in my practice at work of situations where I've talked to kids about sex. And I get a lot of questions, and I'm kind of the person where I can't talk to my parents about this, so I'll talk to Miss Gunter about this. And I'll be honest, there's times where I'm just like, oh my goodness. So I wanted to share a couple scenarios that I have heard over, the course of my career, in where if parents had had conversations with their kids, I don't think these situations would have happened. One that really sticks out to me is there was a situation at somewhere else that I worked, and there was a teenage boy who he and his friends were going around telling girls that they could not get pregnant until the third time they had sex with their new partner. So you can have unprotected sex 2 times without getting pregnant, guaranteed. And because these girls haven't had conversations about it, they believed it. And I remember it was like the wildest thing, because I was like, wait, what? And it was like a series of kiddos coming through my office who were worried about being pregnant, and this is what had happened. And they're so susceptible to wrong information because that's all they have to go on. So it sounds like, oh my gosh, how could that even happen? Another scenario I come across a lot is, sadly, I'm actually on a first name basis with the sexual assault detective for Milpitas PD. And the reason Milpitas PD is because a lot of kids would hang out at the Great Mall, and a lot of situations have happened at the Great Mall. And so one of the things from girls that I've gotten is, I don't know if it's actually rape. I feel confused. I don't know if I should report it. I don't want to ruin somebody's life if I report this. I should have said no more clearly. I think it's like 90% of sexual assaults amongst teenagers go unreported. And I think that's a lot of reason why of the guilt. I should have been more assertive. I didn't really clearly say no. We're dating, so how could it really be rape? Questions like that. That's one that I get. Another one that I've seen a lot is boys who say, and boys and girls, I shouldn't even genderize this, but people who say, I saw what boyfriends and girlfriends do on TV. They hold hands, maybe they, slide their hand down on their bottom, and I got in trouble for it. And I thought I was just doing what dating people do. And even things like holding hands and kissing and, touching require consent. And that's one of the things I want to really stress with my own kids is that, it doesn't just have to be intercourse. It could be anything where you need verbal consent from somebody else to avoid getting yourself in a bad situation. Um, the other one I get is sexual harassment by a friend. Is it harassment if it's your friend? And how do you have boundaries with your friends without hurting their feelings? People are very sweet. I'm kind of the person who doesn't want to hurt other people's feelings, and have gotten myself in situations because I couldn't say no or didn't want to say no because I was afraid to seem like, I was stuck up or I was rude. I don't know if you've ever had that, Jenny, like when you're younger, especially as you're an adult, you start to have more confidence in yourself. But I remember as a younger girl, just feeling like I feel stupid to say no. I don't want to look dumb or like a wuss or like, all these things. And so getting myself in situations because I didn't want to hurt the guy's feelings, like not wanting to even be there, but not wanting to say anything.
Yeah, no, I don't really today feel comfortable getting into my own personal sexual history, but yes, absolutely. And definitely have some experiences that I look back on and I was like, I didn't want to do that. And I felt I didn't know how to say no. And so that was something that I, really, because like you said, Yvonne, you couldn't talk to your mom. I could not talk to my mom about this sort of stuff. I just really distinctly remember like being like 17, and my mom, saying to me like, "Oh, you need to keep your legs crossed until you get married." And I was already sexually active. And so I just like that just taught me like I can't talk to my mom about this. She will not understand. And I love my mother and I have a wonderful relationship with her, but this is one area that I felt like she let me down, because she was not understanding about the topic of sex. She always made a really big deal about the fact that she was a virgin when she married my dad. And that just, it puts a lot of pressure on, I just felt like it doesn't, she's not going to understand, what I need to talk to her about. And so I was always, with my own daughter, like that was like, I'm not, always clear. You can talk to me about anything, I'm not going to judge you. We can talk to you, and so she a couple years ago did have like mom let's talk about sex, and like I was like, oh, all right. And I think I've told you this, Yvonne. I had to pour myself a big glass of wine and I'm like, okay, I'm ready, let's do this. And so we talked, and I never lied to my daughter and I've been really honest with her. But when the issue of consent, she then later, I think it was just last year, told me about some instances that she had where, again, like the consent, she didn't feel comfortable and she didn't know how to say no. And I was like, oh God, like, it felt like situations that I had personally had, she had had something similar. And I was like, and I just felt this like, God, I couldn't protect her from that. And, that was just really hard to deal with and to accept.
Oh, and I think with boys and girls, it's different, right? Sometimes we hyper focus on like making sure you get consent from a girl, but a lot of times we're not teaching girls like what consent really looks like. What's the expectation, on a date? Like, is it okay for somebody to expect something from you when they buy you dinner? I mean, things like that, where you just feel that obligation. I'm just going to run through a couple more of things that I just hear in my practice. And, I hear from girls who are pregnant and whose parents have said that they're not allowed to date. You know, Girls whose self-worth comes from validation from pictures they send out. Normalizing hypersexual behavior. Like, it's normal to hook up with 10 different people in high school. Like, and this is not everybody, this is just things that I run across. Things like that people think are funny that maybe back in the day we wouldn't get like up in arms about, but pantsing people, butt slapping, anything where you're touching somebody in an area that they wouldn't be comfortable with without their permission. I mean, even something like that where your kiddo, sometimes we have goofy freshmen who come in and think they're being funny and get themselves in some really serious trouble. I've had boys who are terrified of sex. Things are happening in their bedroom and they don't know what they are and they're scared. And a lot of times they turn to, the safest place to get your questions answered, which is the internet. I see pornography addiction. I see abusive relationships, power and control issues, things like that. And these are all things that I think could have been avoided, or at least given the space to be able to share if we just had the conversations. Kids don't know how to love, how to be loved. These are things we just assume that humans know, but it's like we don't know the healthy way that looks like unless we're taught. And if we're not taught, we're just going to see either how people are modeling it or what we see on social media or on TV. And if my kiddo's, sex life is going to be based on what he sees on TV, I'm a little worried. So these are a few stats from people who are 18 to 25 years old in regards to conversations they've had with their parents about sex. And so as I'm going through these questions, I want you to listen to each one of these questions and think about, have you had a conversation about this specific topic with your kiddo? And to make you feel better, I think I'm 0 for like 7. So these are things I was like, oh, didn't think about that. The first one is, have you talked to your kid about making sure your partner wants to have sex and is comfortable doing it? Are you talking to your kid about assuring that you're comfortable before even engaging in sex? Have you talked about the importance of not pressuring someone to have sex with you? Have you talked about the importance of not continuing to ask someone to have sex after they have already said no? Have you talked about the importance of not having sex with someone who is too intoxicated or impaired to make a decision about sex? 58% of respondents have never had a conversation with their parents about the importance of being a caring and respectful sexual partner. I can say I've not had a conversation with my kid about being a caring and respectful partner. In fact, I probably haven't had that conversation, period, in my whole life. 70% of the kiddos said that they wished they had received more information from their parents about some emotional aspect of romantic relationships. When kids are engaging in sex with their partner, the emotions are multiplied by 100. Jealousy, anger, sadness, all the things get multiplied when they're engaging in sexual behavior. And they don't realize that intimate connection intensifies the emotions and changes your hormones and all these things that kids just don't know about. Most of the respondents wish that they had received guidance on romantic relationships in their health and sex ed classes. And 76% of respondents said they had never had a conversation with their own parents about how to avoid sexually harassing others. So just all those different points, I haven't had any of them, honestly. Maybe I've talked about the drink. In fact, it was the other night. My husband gave me a glass of wine and my son thought it was funny, oh, dad wants you to be relaxed or whatever. And we had a conversation about giving people alcohol. Maybe people make different choices than they would make if they were sober. That was probably the first time I ever had a conversation like that with one of my boys. I have 3 boys. I'm in my mind now, I'm oh my gosh, I have 3 boys who could make a really avoidable mistake and go to jail. That's seriously how I got to thinking about this. I don't know if you had something, Ginny.
No. I was eager, everything you were, I'm no, I haven't done that. You haven't done that. I mean, I've had conversations with my daughter about relationships and emotions during relationships and strong emotions and how to manage that, and things like jealousy and that sort of thing. But certainly not in regards to sex.
Mm-hmm.
So.
So I have a little video I'm going to play. You may or may not have seen it. Most of our teens have seen it, thankfully, and it makes a lot of sense. So I'll leave it at that as Miss Davis plays it, and then we'll go on to talk a little about how to talk about consent with your kids.
Share my screen. All right, you can see it, right?
Yes.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no, thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, but you wanted tea last night. If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
So much easier to talk about tea than sex, right? And I really like that they address the, if you go through all the trouble to make somebody tea, it's okay to feel frustrated and upset about it, but by all means, they're still not obligated to drink tea. And I think it's important to validate those feelings surrounding sex of like, am I on mute? Oh, I thought it was on mute. So frustration and, nobody, and that's one of the things my mom always told me, and it wasn't directly related to sex, was like, you don't owe anybody anything, right? And I think it's that culture of like owing people things. A couple of years back, we had a training for the social workers, and we're all women, and we all are, we try to be really nice. And it was a adrenaline response training, and it was basically this guy was all in gear, and he came up behind us and would like literally like sexually harass us, and we were supposed to be like, no, get away from me. It was the hardest training we ever did because we didn't want to hurt his feelings. And this is something I talk with teenagers all the time about, is like, you do not owe anybody anything. Even down to like, I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but if you're in the car driving and some person who looks a little strange walks close to your car, I used to not lock the door because I didn't want them to hear the door and be offended by it. Like, I put somebody else's feelings above my gut instinct to feel safe. And that's something that people do all the time. And so it's really important that we talk to our children about, feeling safe, prioritizing your safety. And if we accidentally hurt somebody's feelings in the process, that's better than us getting hurt. And I think that's something that is really hard for people to do. You want to be nice, you want to be seen as nice. But when it comes to sex and consent, it's like, we need to learn how to advocate for ourselves and speak very clearly. It's something where you're like, I don't know, things like that, like teaching our kids that no, So this is a little section about like, how do we talk about consent? It's so important that we talk about consent and that we revisit it, because consent changes, right? Just like in the video, it's like, I might have wanted tea Saturday, but I don't want tea today. And it's okay to change your stance. And it's really important to implement, how do we talk to our kids about boundaries and having boundaries? It says step 1, discuss boundaries. Consent is steeped in personal boundaries, but many teens struggle to establish and maintain healthy boundaries. Teens need to learn that they define their own boundaries. Your boundaries might look different than somebody else's. Maybe you're comfortable holding hands. Maybe you're comfortable kissing. Maybe you're not, and it's okay if you're not. It's perfectly normal for boundaries to shift during the course of a romantic relationship. And it talks about like giving examples, like how do we give examples of our, of consent and boundaries to our kids? Perhaps a teen is comfortable holding hands and hugging in the beginning phase of a relationship, but isn't ready for anything else. That's a boundary. As a relationship progresses and trust builds, the teen might shift that boundary a bit to include kissing, and so on and so forth. Here's the catch. Boundaries can shift, but they can also be revoked. If at any point a teen experiences discomfort, the teen can redefine the boundary again. But it's also important to discuss what it looks like when one partner crosses the boundary of another. Like, what do you do? Is it ever okay to kiss someone who said they don't want to be kissed? You know, what about hugging? What if one partner is set on a holding hands boundary? When is it okay to move towards hugging? And I think it's all about dialogue, making sure you have that conversation. And like you said, Jenny, in the beginning, and it's my husband too, it's like, it's not even comfortable to talk to me about sex. So we're having to empower our kids to have conversations, to be able to say, you know, I'm not quite ready for kissing yet. I'm really comfortable where we are holding hands. Like, it even sounds weird saying it, doesn't it? Like, it's just like, that's not like a natural dialogue for our kids. So we have to make sure that we're making it normal, you know, making it normal to talk about stuff like that.
And I think part of it is, you know, if they read books or watch movies or TV shows, like you never see characters in a movie having these conversations. It just seems like they naturally just fall in love and like everything progresses the way it's supposed to. But that's Hollywood, like that's not real life. And so I would love to see like the awkwardness of relationships like clearly depicted in a movie or a TV show, because it is really awkward in the beginning.
Yeah.
It doesn't just naturally
Just
happen.
picture like a romantic movie where he's leaning in and then he's like, wait a minute, is it okay if I kiss you? Right? Like,
Yeah. I just wish that they could see that as an example, but I think that, you know, as parents, that's what we have to fight against. Like, yeah, it is awkward. It is uncomfortable. It's going to be weird. Like, it doesn't seem like it's romantic and nice and like lovely, you know, where you've got the music playing and they're going to lean in and kiss you know, they stop and say like, are you okay? And I actually think it's really important to teach our daughters not only to expect the question, ask the question themselves. Like, is it okay if we're going to do this? Like, they, you know, because boys can be pressured into doing things that they're uncomfortable with also. And so
absolutely.
like those conversations I think need to happen both ways. I think that we need to teach our daughters how to be clear about when they're uncomfortable and be okay with ask, you know, like saying that they're uncomfortable and that they aren't ready to move on, but then also be okay with asking the questions too. Like, because you may have the girl in a relationship um, wanting to move faster than the boy is ready. And like for the boy, and I don't know if you give on that you were going to get into this, I think it's really, you know, with our sons, it's really important. These conversations are so very, very important because they need to like know how to communicate and ask the right questions and, you know, make sure that their partner is comfortable with what they're doing, but they need to be okay with their own uncomfort level. And I think that this is something, you know, actually like in my reading, I'm like, oh, maybe we should do a whole separate topic on raising our sons and fighting against toxic masculinity, because it's
Yes.
not something in our culture that is seen as like, okay, boys, you know, can feel uncomfortable about this stuff and can talk about this stuff. That's not um, something that's seen as like the norm. Hopefully I think that's starting to change. And I see
I
with like
think
the
so.
younger generation, definitely seems like it's changing, but it's like, you know, all of the images out there, you know, in the world, like, you know, with media and everything, that's what we're fighting against. And I think it's really important for us to have those conversations.
I like that toxic masculinity. I've had conversation with boys who are like, my girlfriend sent me this picture and I don't know what to do. I'm afraid to tell her not to because I don't want her to think that I think she's ugly, but I just think it's not okay to send stuff like that, especially if I've never seen her like that in real life. And I'm like, whoa, I never even would have thought about having that conversation with the guy, you know? And like you said, it's like guys don't feel safe saying that they don't want to have sex or that they're uncomfortable or that somebody's moving too fast. You know, it makes them feel like it's wrong, like it in to normalize that, like, yeah, you should feel uncomfortable, this is something that's new, this is something you want to take your time on, you know, you're not obligated to make any rash decisions about engaging with sex with somebody that you're not sure you want to. um Defining consent, I think people think consent is like yes or no, and it's so much more than that. It's like it's a constant process between the people engaging in sex, right? It's like always changing. It's specific to each activity, right? If somebody's okay going to third base, does that mean automatically that they are ready to go all the way? No, it's like each activity has to have specific consent. It can be given at any time. It can be taken back at any time. It can only be given in a clear mindset, with alcohol, with drugs, if somebody's tired, if they're in a bad headspace, if they're having an emotional crisis, not taking advantage of that vulnerability. Consent is ongoing. Both partners have to feel safe and comfortable. And consent doesn't exist if pressure or coercion is used to gain this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual harassment and sexual assault. And one of the big factors in there is emotional manipulation and coercion. And that happens a lot with partners who, if you love me, you'll do XYZ, right? And it gets very confusing because maybe they do love you and maybe that's coercion. And what people don't realize is that you can get in a lot of trouble if your partner. So I guess I'll just talk about it now. The age of consent in California, to legally be able to consent to sex is 18. Okay, there's a lot of, room in there for different interpretations, but legally you're not allowed to consent until you're 18 years old. Some states have what they call Romeo and Juliet laws. And that basically means if you're close in age and you're both underage and consenting, that you're not going to get in trouble for it. And that's not actually true. There's been instances where, like, let's say a 18-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy are engaging in sex and it's consensual, and then they break up and the boy's mad and the boy says, I was raped by this girl. Big trouble. And so just knowing that I actually can't legally consent until I'm 18. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but it's just something to be very hyper aware about, is that you could potentially get yourself in a sticky situation without, knowing. So parents need to talk about the difference between verbal and nonverbal consent. If I'm shrugging my shoulders and not really sure, that means I'm not really comfortable. I'm not really sure. So even if I didn't say no, my sheepishness and my insecurity surrounding it is still saying no. Verbal consent's always going to be best because it's clear. It gives each partner the opportunity to change their mind and discuss their desires openly. Another thing to discuss is respect and trust building. Like we were just talking about this, between movies and TV, relationships move very quickly if you're looking out from the outside in. But teens have to understand that real romantic relationships rely on respect, trust, and taking time, right? Ask your teens to think of scenarios where they're in the position of needing to respect the personal boundary of a partner. It can be difficult. Talk about rejection. If your partner says no and you're feeling rejected, how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? If one teen wants to move forward, in their physical relationship and one doesn't, how do we deal with that? Those are things that we need to be talking about. Again, not comfortable, not things that my kids, I know for a fact, don't want to talk about me. I still don't want to talk to my parents about it. I know I mentioned this before, but when I was married and pregnant, I didn't want to tell my dad because he knew I was having sex. That's how I feel talking to my parents. So I get it. It's not comfortable. The next one is just helping your teen talk very specifically. Everything is very vague, right? Even our teen talk, it's very vague, but it's really important to talk about specifics. Romantic relationships, it's all very confusing, and we have to work under the assumption that they don't know. Sometimes, even for me, I assume, well, he's 18, he probably knows. I don't know what he knows, right? I don't know if he really truly does know. And I have to work under the assumption that he knows nothing. Because some of these kiddos I come across, I'm like, how did you not know that? Wow. I don't tell them that, obviously, but how did you get to 18 and not learn this very basic thing about sex, right? How you get pregnant and STDs and these things that nobody really wants to talk about. It's uncomfortable for the kiddo and for the parent, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between sexual harassment and sexual assault, because this is something that comes up. I'll go back to when I talk to the detective from Milpitas, I've had many instances where I have to work with her, and so many of these situations could have been avoided with a little bit of information, right? About, dating and getting consent and, you know, being able to advocate for yourself and say no. Sexual assault and harassment is something that can happen anywhere. It can happen in a classroom, it can happen at school, it can happen on the street. It doesn't matter where it happens. Even if you're like laying in your bed and somebody's in there with you, it can still happen there. So it doesn't matter where it happens, but it's basically an unwelcome sexual advance or request for sexual favor or other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. This could be anything like, oh, your butt looks really good in those pants. Something somebody might think is a compliment and they're saying it in a joking manner. These kind of things can be constituted as sexual harassment. And it's really important for our kids to know that even something that can seem silly can be something that they get in really big trouble for. We see it all the time. And it's somebody who most likely didn't mean any harm, and then it just goes bad from there. We've had kids have to move schools because of it, and all these different scenarios that could have definitely been avoided. So that's like harassment. So when we think of harassment, just like verbal stuff, where, or even the physical harassment of like poking someone or touching someone they don't want to be touched, is constituted as harassment. And assault is different, and sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the victim. This is rape, attempted rape, unwanted sexual touching, forcing, coercing. And again, about the coercion can include the use of physical force or emotional manipulation. And this I've seen with, doesn't matter the gender, of emotionally manipulating somebody to engage in sexual relationship. And again, it's like, I thought you loved me. This is how people show love. It's like using your words and their feelings to get what somebody wants. And some people do it unknowingly. It's not always malicious, like, oh, I'm going to get her to have sex with me, but it's maybe somebody truly believes that that's how you show somebody love. And when their partner's not giving them that love, they're making them feel bad about it, and they're putting them in situations where they want to, to please their partner. And that's a scary thing, because when you're a teenager, you're vulnerable. You want to be loved. You don't really know what love is yet. And you're going to do the things that you think are going to make your partner happy, even if they make you uncomfortable. And these are things that we don't talk about. I mean, obviously, I get to talk about them with teenagers at work, but I don't talk about it with teenagers at home, But this is something like all through like dating. There's certain, I was reading about like certain countries, I don't know if you read any of this, Jenny, that talk about consent and dating and relationship from like preschool on. Like they're always talking about consent. Like if you don't want to hug your uncle and you're not comfortable with that, it's okay to say, can I wave at you instead? Something as simple as that is like, I remember my mom forcing me to hug creepy outside relatives that I didn't know. And that's something that I see more people doing now, is like not forcing our kids to ever feel uncomfortable.
That was definitely something I noticed with my two kids, and just, parenting advice and like what's out there and like articles and things like that.
Yeah.
There's a 6-year age difference between my kids. And so when my daughter was little, I felt like there was nothing out there with that. And I, certainly am guilty of like, oh, Hannah, give your grandparents a hug or give your uncle a hug and like that sort of thing. And then when my son was little, that 6-year difference, there was just a lot more articles and advice out there. Don't force your kid to do this. And I think even in the doctor's office, like, where they give you those little like sheets of like age thing, and like, I remember like that being an advice, like, start teaching your child about consent and don't force them to hug a stranger or relative if they don't feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's, definitely I did, did that differently. And with my son, did not force him to do that.
Because for me growing up, I mean, that's rude, right? Like to not do something. It totally negates my feelings of like how I feel about that specific person. You know, some people give you creepy vibes, right? And you're still forced to do, relative or not, it doesn't matter, you know, because those kind of things happen amongst families and things like that. And so not letting your kiddo trust their instincts, like, is something that I would totally do differently. Um, I'm not an expert in the law by any means. There's a couple things that I do know just based on my work experience, and we're talking about like statutory rape, penal code. I think it's 261 something or not. I can't remember, but it's basically like these are scenarios that have been categorized under that and in situations that I've had. One of them was a 19-year-old female and a 16-year-old male. She ended up in some really hot water. Another one is high school sweethearts, been dating for a long time. He's 18, she's 16. They've been having sex for 3 years. So when they started having sex, he was 16 and she was 13. So Ginny, I don't know if I have the ability to share
I can give it to you. Go ahead.
my screen. So this here, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is basically our guideline in our practice. So I tell students all the time, like everything you say to me stays confidential. There's certain situations where I would have to report. And this is basically a little table here of the age of partner and then the age of my client coming down the left side column. And it tells you when you're obligated to file a report. So if you see here, like if my patient is 13 years old and the partner is 14 years old, do I have to make a report? And the answer is yes. And so the kind of frightening part of this is a lot of our freshmen come in at 13. And 13 is that number where consensual or not, it's always something that I'm going to have to report. I'm not obligated to report sex between teenagers who are 16 and 17 years old, even 14, you know, and 16. Those are things, but that number 13 is a really big deal. And, you know, in my experience, every single year, the freshmen are excited to see the older kiddos on campus, you know, and there was so much room for danger here and not even knowing it. It's like, oh, high school kid versus high school kid. Yeah, high school kid and high school kid. But there are some very specific requirements for us to report. And when that report happens, it's not a CPS report, it's a police report. And that's something that I know none of us want our 14-year-old kids dealing with, right? And they might not know that, like, oh, we're the same age. It doesn't matter. This kiddo is not, neither of you are able to legally consent until you're 18 years old. And so just take a quick look at this and you can kind of just put numbers together of like, yes, yes, or no requirement for consent. Something I've learned over the years is if I have somebody come and say, you know, they were date raped, right? I have an obligation to call the police, and I do, and I call the parent and let them know. If that child is not willing to tell the story on their own, the detective will give them a business card and hope and pray that at some point they will share their story. And I say that because I have parents who are obviously upset and outraged, yet their kid is not wanting to report it. And there's not a thing that the parent can do to pursue that charge on their own. They need the words and the experience of that kid. And because our kids are so uncomfortable and so worried about getting someone else in trouble or looking bad or feeling like they did something wrong, that's why these things go unreported. Because even if I call the police, it's not technically the report until the kid gives their side of the story, right? It's basically like me telling the cop, but she has to, or they have to substantiate my story. More often than not, it doesn't happen. You know, I've had girls and boys who have met somebody on the internet and something happened, and, you know, they were too afraid to say anything, even after I had to make the report. And so I think it is so important to have these conversations. And this last part is basically just like, how do we talk about that? How do we make them the most comfortable in a very uncomfortable situation? And the first part is find a way to be objective. Talking about sexuality with their child doesn't have to be an emotionally laden time bomb most of us imagine. You know, when parents sort out their own thoughts, views, and emotions regarding sex and intimacy, they'll be able to enter into the conversation from a neutral and supportive stance. Easy as a parent to be like, just don't have sex. Everything bad can come of that. Don't do it. It doesn't leave our kids room to be human, right? And then they know that you don't want them having sex, so you're going to be the last person they talk to about it. This means letting go of what we see, know, and have come to learn about sex through our own subjective lens and seeing things from a new and natural perspective. Human sexuality is natural and healthy. And I can have conversations for days with my kids about things that I've experienced. And to be honest, our kids don't want to know about our sex life. Right.
One thing I was about to say is, and this I found this has worked in the past couple years very nicely with my daughter. I have to find something similar to do this with my son but my daughter, she and I actually watched Love Island together, which was a terrible trash show, but all sorts of issues about sex and stuff like that. And so we would like talk about it like in like, oh, these are the people on the TV show. And but it could like we were able to have a broader conversation about sex and consent and like body positivity and things like that. Same thing with she just over this past summer we rewatched the Twilight series together, and then she's been rereading the Twilight books. And I don't know if you guys have read the Twilight books or reread them, but if you're curious, I recommend rereading them in the eyes of consent, in like that frame of mind, because there are some really icky things in the Twilight books between the characters of Bella and Jacob. Like Jacob does not understand consent, and that whole idea of pressuring and like it honestly, like now that I just know better, it makes me super uncomfortable. But like we've had some really great conversations about that. And so like I said, like I'm like seeing that as like an opportunity, with my son on movies that he may be interested in, and like any sort of relationships or something that you can pick out as like, oh, that's an opportunity to talk about it without having to talk about your kid with like their life and their friends and like or you sharing your own experiences, which are going to totally like ick out your kid. They don't want to hear about your sex life. They
don't waste the opportunity. Whatever that opportunity is, right? I know we talked about this before, and my kids watch The Bachelor with me, and that sounds really bad, but there's so many instances and opportunities in that show of like, do you think that's something that people in healthy relationships say? Right? When the girls start acting crazy and they're jealous, is that something that you would want in a partner? Would you want your partner to present themselves like that to the world? Is that something you're comfortable with? And again, like you said, easier to discuss somebody else than yourself, especially if your kids aren't even dating yet. So being objective, avoiding judgment and lectures. That's the last thing that we need. We're already uncomfortable. And this is not your time to impart all of your wonderful wisdom about sex and relationships. This is your time to listen and guide, especially if they ask you to guide them. So just avoid judging. That was, like I said, like being raised in the religious environment that way. And not that religion's bad, but in that sense, for me, it was an obstacle of just like, I don't even have the opportunity to talk because I know it's already bad. So let's just leave it. Focus on do's instead of don'ts. Don't have sex. Don't have sex unprotected. Don't. Okay, well, what do I do? Well, you have open dialogue in your relationships. You make sure that you're getting consent. These are things that you need to do. The don't. It's just like, okay, so what do I do? Make sure that they know what they're supposed to do. Don't waste the opportunity. Discussions about sexuality need not only be about anatomy, but also incorporate a myriad of crucial social and emotional topics. We talk about sex. We're also talking about relationships, intimacy, gender, self-expression, health, pregnancy, emotional responses, physically, there's a lot of questions like physically, what is sex all about? People don't know that. And that curiosity is, something that can have them engaging earlier than they should be. This is where unsurprisingly, the Dutch begin a curriculum using these concepts as early as kindergarten. Children are shown images of physical affection, such as hugs, and asked why people might be hugging. Teachers prompt them to think about how they feel when engaging in these same interactions with their favorite people. Children respond with insightful reactions such as, "It makes me feel warm on the inside." These lessons are designed to get kids talking and thinking about what kind of physical intimacy feels good and what doesn't. And I mean, obviously my kids are way beyond that, but just something to consider of like, man, where are the opportunities for me to talk about things that feel good, things that don't, trusting your gut. I have people all the time, clients all the time who are telling me something. I'm like, it really sounds to me like your instincts are telling you this, and they're not even in tune with their own instincts. And so that's something that we work on a lot of, like, that's something is telling you something and you really have to trust that. And I love that curriculum for, the kids. It's like, you have to feel comfortable. And what does uncomfortable feel like? What does that look like for you? Like, just very specific questions about it. This last part says, go boldly where most parents haven't gone before. While society has lots of inaccurate and confusing messages to offer our kids, parents have the power to offer more. Research indicates it's time for us to grow up and start getting more comfortable with attitudes on sexuality. We have a ton of influence. Teens say that their parents are the most influential people in their lives. Whether it seems like it or not, your kids take cues from you. These exchanges form the lens which they'll interpret their intimate relationships. So let's get past mistaking openness for permissiveness. We can empower and inform our kids while still making our values and expectations clear. So that's what I got. I mean, it was a lot of eye-opening stuff for myself in my work with my kids, trying to figure out where the best place to have the conversations are. Do I take them out one at a time? I'm going to figure it all out, but I know now how important it is to avoid things that could have been avoided, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Well, good luck to all of us on having these conversations with our kids. And hopefully this is inspiring and gave some ideas to parents about how start these conversations or what to say. We'll keep talking about this topic. This isn't a one and done, but this is such an important topic. And we owe it to our kids to prepare them for the real world. I mean, I think this is, like I said, it's very uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about this, but I think this is one of those areas that like we talk about parenting jobs, and like last week we talked about the expectations. Like this is something that really falls down on like, this is an expectation of parent that you have these conversations, even though they're super uncomfortable.
not, not fun, but necessary.
Next week, we're going to talk about some more, maybe not fun, but relaxing. We're going to talk about self-care next week and how to model that for your kids. So taking care of yourself so that your kids can learn how to take care of themselves. So that will be a lighter, more enjoyable topic.
For all of us.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your, have a wonderful rest of your day. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.